Today we will be talking with Ivars Ijabs, a member of European Parliament from Latvia. And we will be discussing how does European Union evolve to make sure that we are competitive. We are competitive on the global scene, for example, in comparison to the United States. I mean, what we wanted to discuss today, given your both professional affiliation as a professional politologist, right, and then also you being you're a member of European Parliament, is Baltics as a contributor to Europe, Baltics as a contributor to European economy, Baltics as a contributor to European political process. We can clearly see that today the Baltic states, Poland, are contributors to European security agenda with a very clear stance on security, etc. And as we discussed before the interview started, if we go back to the United States establishment, there was this famous Federalist 10 paper, which would say that if you just have one state, there is a high possibility of this one state being a little bit corrupted or sub-optimized. If you have United States of America or united countries in Europe, then this somehow helps each state to be better off, right? And so I wanted to kind of direct our discussion maybe in this.
Well, I mean, the EU is not a federation in that sense,
yes,
because, this is very much also an international organization because the basic political process is still going on in the national capitals. Mm-hmm. Being an MEP myself, I'm an absolute Euro optimist, and I come from the most optimistic group in the European Parliament, which is this Renew Europe group. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, I have to admit that the basic political process is still going on in the national capitals, in national democracies. By the way, this is also where the largest part of the budget is being collected and being spent. Mm-hmm. Because if you look at the EU, it redistributes something like 1.1% of the European GDP, which is €1 trillion for 7 years. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, this is just 1.1% of the GDP. But coming back to your question, what's the economic contribution of the Baltics right now? I mean, right now, of course, up until 2004, that was one of our main goals to get into that organization, because right now we are seeing what's happening with those countries in this region which didn't make it, meaning of course Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and so on and so forth, and their security situation is much more precarious than ours. But at the same time, of course, now it's the time to reap the economic benefits of this membership, and this is what we, especially I'm talking about Latvia, we haven't always been very successful in doing that, because of course we are part of the internal market. At the same time, we are on the outer rim of the European Union, which means that, we have to devote energy in order to attract investment, in order to get people think that this is really a good place to work, to live, and so on and so forth. I think that, the story about us being a bridge between, the CIS countries and Russia on the one hand and the West on the other, this story is gone. It doesn't have any relevance anymore because of the Russian aggression. Right now, of course, we have to think about our development also in terms of human capital, and this is, I think, one of the issues where we still see some problems. I mean, you come from the IT, you know what does it mean to have a demand for skilled labor force, which could be capable of working in the 21st century environment. So this might be one of the challenges. But as for our economic contribution, I think that, there are many fields where we are, and we still play a certain role. I think in Latvia, this is very much pharmaceuticals, also bioeconomy in terms of wood production and wood processing, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, of course, nowadays it's especially hard to attract investment, and this is what we should all think about.
Indeed, because if we look economically speaking, which may be a bit easier than political process. If we have Air Baltic, a company coming from Latvia, then we have Maksims, a company coming from Lithuania. Most probably, we cannot have two Maksims originating in the Baltic market. And then, a lot of our thinking, if we think about ourselves, is connected, specifically to the country. Whereas economically speaking, I guess most of the economic abilities or our ability to contribute back to a stronger Europe comes from our ability to pool the market forces, at least between the three Baltic states. You say education, right? It is probably pretty difficult to have very competitive institutions if we have to compete with the United Kingdom, for example, or we have to compete with France, which are, much bigger.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that you need some kind of a growth strategy for each and every country in living in an open economic environment. And we are three of the most integrated countries in the whole world, because we are members of all possible organizations, probably with the exception of G20 or G7 or something like that. But we are members of all possible, starting from, of course, the EU and NATO, but also Eurozone, OECD, and all the possible organizations. We are open in that sense, and I am not sure to what extent do we recognize the very fact that our economic success depends on this openness, and to work for export, import, to deal with our international partners, seeing that as a part of a national strategy. I think this is an important thing we should be dealing with, because in terms of Latvian government and Latvian, those planning documents you see, there is very little understanding of where is the growth going to come from.
Yes.
Yeah. For example, your field is, of course, one of the most promising in that sense, but the problem is that, of course, we are not the only ones who are thinking about this. And that's why I think that most countries, also in Central Eastern Europe, still have a little bit more concrete growth strategies, that we are going for this and probably not for that. But in Latvia, it's still, undecided.
Because, this is what we're thinking a lot about in technology. If we look at the United States, if we look at Europe, if we look at China, we see a lot of digital champions in the US and in China. When we look at Europe, we see some champions like Spotify, like SAP.
Which is probably the only one.
Yes, but we don't see enough, right? When we look at, let's say, big cloud players that have built their own clouds, these companies are mostly coming from the United States. Then, all of the artificial intelligence is based on cloud, right? I think we've done a good job in Europe from GDPR perspective, from framing, how things should be done, as opposed, how not to do things. But then how do we get this other piece, this innovation piece, this engine piece, creating companies that would be, world champions rather than only European?
Well, this is, first of all, about Europe as such, and of course the Baltics should find their place in that process. But you are absolutely right that we are lagging behind, and also the European institutions and the European Parliament, we are absolutely conscious of the fact that we are lagging behind. We don't have any, such amount of unicorns. So, as for the big, let's say, all the big platforms, Spotify is probably the poster child of Europe. But if you look at your mobile phone and look which apps are you using, very few of them are going to be European, right? Yes. And that's why, of course, we are thinking about this. In terms of innovation, I think that Europe is still struggling because, of course, we have a lot of fundamental science. For example, all the vaccines, by the way, all the COVID vaccines, initially the formulas were produced, most of them in Europe, if we count still the UK as Europe. But nevertheless, in terms of production and commercialization of those innovations, we are still very much lagging behind. And in that sense, I don't think that there is much hope in catching up with the US in, let's say, next 5 or 10 years, because, this is about the culture of innovation. This is not just about having a right or wrong policy. This is very much about culture of innovation, which in the US it's very rampant. the EU is much more slow, much more bureaucratic, of course. And that's why we consider ourselves as being a regulatory superpower, meaning that we are a regulator. Basically, the global regulator you just mentioned, the GDPR, but there are quite a few new legislation coming up in terms of AI Act, Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, Data Act, and so on and so forth. We consider ourselves as regulators. We succeed in that, by the way, because the GDPR has become already a part of the global landscape in that field. But if we think about our capacity to innovate, I think that the secret strategy has been always, well, of course, we don't have such a potential as not just the US, as this is not about the US, this is very much about California and a few other places in the US who are producing most of those big breakthroughs. But at the same time, of course, we consider ourselves also as not just the innovator, but the green innovator. That this new Green Deal is part of, well, we are not capable of innovating on such a scale as the US does, but we are going to be most green, and we are going to make the world much greener, because we are going to make this our priority. And this has been the case, at least since 2019, when the current commission started working.
And then what are those directions in making Europe more green, as opposed to US and China?
I mean, first of all, this is a multi-dimensional process. First of all, imposing certain standards of production in terms of not producing less, but producing in a greener way, which of course needs much investment, and this is what the EU and the European Commission is dealing with right now, to get that innovation with this famous taxonomy, that if you are going to need some kind of a loan from your bank to open a business, the first thing the bank is going to look at is the environmental footprint of your production. And if it's worse than a certain standard, you just simply won't get money. This is about the carbon capture. This is about this new system of the so-called CBAM, which is going to start working from 2024, which means that all the steel and cement being produced in those countries which do not have those climate obligations in terms of CO2 emissions, they are going to pay a special tax in order to export their steel or cement into the EU, which is also, it has a certain global ambition, and in that sense, I think this is quite reasonable, because climate change is a reality.
And then if we think about this winter, and the situation with gas is, of course, awful from the side of prices, etc. But it kind of seems a little bit less awful than we feared. So do you think there is a realistic plan that right now Europe will use this huge hit and then jump off a lot of carbon-inducing, energy sources? So can we use it as a, major transition into green space?
Well, this is a good question, because nobody knows. This is what we hope. Because, of course, on the other hand, there is also a certain pushback to go into the opposite direction, in terms of, for example, the Poles opening their coal plants again, which is a problem. But of course, the main push is, yes, that we need more renewables being installed, and there the situation is quite diverse among the member states, because first of all, we have been talking about the cost of non-Europe. Of course, energy is one of the places where we see that very much depends on interconnectors between countries. For example, why is the electricity so expensive in Latvia? Just simply because we don't have a decent interconnector with Estonia, where they are having a cheaper electricity. And this is very much an interconnectors thing, and having a common market for energy. And if we would have something like that, I think that would be great, but at the same time, Europe is still very much a union of 27 member states. And of course, not just politicians, but also entrepreneurs and business people in the countries, they are protecting their own, influence, their own national interest. And for example, there are not talking about the Baltics, where we'll still have some interconnectors being built, but for example, there is no decent interconnector between Spain and France in terms of electricity. Can you imagine? These are not some kind of post-communist Eastern Europe. These are the real old Europe, and they are also rather reluctant to have that, because Spain produces a lot of renewables. They are having a lot of wind and solar, but the French are not happy to buy it from them, because they say that we want our own electricity, and with those nuclear plants and so on and so forth. This is very much fragmented. Europe, if compared to the US, Europe is still very much fragmented in terms of energy policy.
From political perspective, is it possible to turn it into advantage? Because we're lacking certain scale on one side, but on the other side, if you have different states doing different things, this is the poster boy example of experimentation. Right? One state or one nation does it one way, the other state, if you talk to Nordic people, all of these countries are actually very different, right? But they still are more successful together, I would say. So how is it possible to make Europe more successful together than it is?
Well, I think that the EU has a lot of instruments to make those countries cooperate. And this is an instrument which has to be used in terms of promoting different kinds of cooperation in many different spheres. For example, right now, since the war is still going on, we know that there are countries that have already given a lot of their stocks and reserves in terms of ammunition to Ukraine, which means that these stocks should be refilled somehow. But the usual procedure is that each country buys the military procurement, all the military stuff, including cartridges, they are buying it themselves. But at the same time, the European Commission right now, and this is where I am also having a certain role, is pushing those member states into direction of having common procurement, which would make these things, first of all, much cheaper. And secondly, it would, to have this interoperability among countries. Well, the European Commission has very big role in this nudging process to induce the member states to cooperate among themselves. Of course, there are those things like the GDPR and so on and so forth, which have a legal force, which have to be obliged because it's a law. It's a law. But in many spheres, like military, like health, for example, this is very much about nudging, having a certain amount of money, but at the same time also using that money to induce countries to cooperate among themselves, including research and innovation, which is my field to a large extent, because research and innovation, we have this money which is devoted to partnerships. That, for example, a Latvian institute, cooperates with whatever Fraunhofer in Germany or something like that.
And then if we look at the EU political process and this nudging process, and then the relationship between different countries, and then the small groups that different countries create, so how do you say, how did it change over the last 40 years? How countries find consensus between each other? Because when we first created the EU, or when we joined the EU, it was something new. Countries had to adopt. Now this process, we can arguably say is, well-oiled. People know the limitations and the possibilities. Do we get more out of the process? How does it work in that relation?
I think that we are getting more skilled and more conscious about our possible partners. And we know that we have to play a multi-directional game because it depends very much on a particular topic where you can find your partners. And well, in that sense, I think that Europe is working also for Latvia. We haven't been very extremely active in European institutions, but nevertheless, Europe works also for our interests, because we are starting to get conscious about our own national interests in that context. For example, well, there are questions where we are very much on the same page with, let's say, Romania, which is a big country, by the way, with a lot of MEPs in the European Parliament, and in that sense, there was a lot of influence. And but it is also one of so-called cohesion countries, of those countries who are getting more money from the EU funds and paying into those funds, which means that there is a lot of common interest with Romanians. There are spheres, for example, well, in terms of having a liberal market and competition, we are on the same page with the Nordics, because the Nordics are very similar in that sense. They are also not so big. What they are interested in is to having a level playing field in many spheres, but we just can't cooperate with the Nordics or in terms of social policy, because the Nordics, they are very much protective about their own systems. For example, there was just this debate about having a European minimum wage, and the Nordics are very much against that. Just leave us alone with your minimum wage. We're absolutely happy with our system, what we are having for centuries. And of course, in Latvia, and in many other countries, this idea of having a certain standard, how to set the minimum wage, is very much desirable. So, well, it depends very much how do you find your partners in particular situations. And right now, of course, I think what unites us regionally is, of course, the security dimension, which also spills over into economy, because right now we are talking about the military industry and defense industry being restored. And
for the first time, yes.
This is what we are doing, by the way, in cooperation with our Estonian friends, with our Finnish friends. And, well, all those kind of half-forgotten things about hard power are coming back.
And then from a kind of political spectrum perspective, when we think about US, it's always, there is a big divide, and divide is growing between the more conservative part of society and the more liberal part of society. There are extreme politicians on both ends, arguably. And how do you see this process in Europe? Because I think we also had our divide, but then it kind of disappeared, it kind of evaporated, at least my feeling. Even before the war, it is much, much less than it was, let's say, 5-10 years ago when, Brexit happened. There was, more of a divide than, at least I feel there is today.
Yes, because, well, also the Ukrainian war is what makes us more united, and even kind of seemingly Eurosceptic countries and Eurosceptic governments like the Italian one,
yes,
also is on the board, even despite Berlusconi being part of the ruling coalition and so on and so forth. But, well, if you, this is very much, well, by the way, what you started with, this idea of balance of power and checks and balances, and where all the subjects are looking at each other and preventing corruption in that way. I think that this is still very much working like that, because this is a division between the parliament, which is a directly elected body, which is very much federalist. It is very much federalist in the sense that we want bigger budget, we want more coordination, we want more common European approaches in everything, having, for example, a common European health system, or having a common European standard for all the food products and so on and so forth. Parliament is a federalist, and but the council, this is where all the heads of governments are coming together. They are very much about keeping their national interests intact, and this is an interplay. But in terms of, let's say, election results, I do not see right now any serious threats in terms of the EU falling apart because all the governments are, well, Euro-optimistic, especially in such turbulent times where everyone sees that Europe is, well, it's not perfect, but nevertheless Europe is, well, the best way to organize things in this continent and not just relying on national interest. Well, there are some Eurosceptic governments. Probably the most notorious one is the Hungarian one, which is openly Eurosceptic. But, well, this is very much about, not just talking the talk, but also walking the walk, in the sense that Orban is talking a lot about how bad Brussels is and what nasty federalists they are over there in Brussels and how they are going to destroy all the real Christian values. But at the same time, he's extremely happy about getting those European funds and promoting his own, partially corrupted domestic industry. And in that sense, I mean, this process is very, very, I would say, dynamic, in a sense that, there are governments that are, like the Polish or Hungarian one. Sometimes one might even think about the Bulgarians in that same vein, and so on and so forth. They are, using that Eurosceptic rhetoric in order to get their votes from a certain part of the population, but at the same time they are benefiting very much from the EU membership.
And from the change programs, integration and cohesion programs.
Well, I mean, you can see the same in Latvia. You see some parties represented in our parliament where, and who are also municipalities. These are parties and politicians that benefit very much from the European funds, but they get their funds, but it doesn't prevent them from using a Eurosceptic or nationalist rhetoric
during the elections.
Yeah. I mean, this is the game. This is how this is being done everywhere, basically. In that sense, I think that, by the way, the recent events, also the Ukrainian war and so on and so forth, we have seen that this divide between the old member states, those that were members up until 2004, and the new member states, this divide is going to close, I think, because this is, for example, the Latvians and the Balts. We should also strive into that direction as fast as possible. The Czechs are going to become a donor country, in a sense that, their GDP is going to be above the EU average, which means that they are going to pay.
The first one.
Yeah.
And then this parliament is the first parliament without the UK.
Well, this was an extremely sad story.
Yes.
I remember we had in our political group the Lib Dems from the UK, because there were quite a few of them, I think 20 or something. And this was when they were leaving, being Euro optimists, all of them. This was a very moving and very kind of sad moment. They also installed for the last evening degustation of single malt Scotch whiskies, and this was an extremely strange, sad party. But yes, this is the only. And of course, in terms of our interest, the Baltic perspective when looking at the Brexit, of course, this is bad for us because they were reliable partners in many ways. They were, first of all, pro-market, as opposed to the French, for example. Yes. And they were also very Atlantic in their approach. They looked at the US as the main source of European security, as well, as opposed to some other European countries, and losing them was a bad thing for the Baltics. But nevertheless, that's why we have been starting to think about other formats, how to get them in again.
How did the process, the dynamics of getting to agreement change after the United Kingdom left? So there was this expectation that the Dutch would replace them as the closest in ideology and philosophy.
Yes, I mean, this did happen, and in that sense, I think that the Dutch influence is growing, and well, Mark Rutte is going to be one of the most visible prime ministers in Europe, and also one of the oldest serving ones, which is important because in terms of council, it's very important to look how long does a particular person have this particular office. But the Dutch are influential, but in terms of shifting the balance of power, I think that in many ways, especially regarding the security and defense issues, the Poles have quite a substantial role, even despite the fact that their government is far right and very conservative. But nevertheless, right now, they are bearing the biggest burden in dealing with that Russian aggression in Ukraine, which means that their moral authority is very high. And, well, the French are, of course, being a very important country, especially with Macron being re-elected. But nevertheless, I mean, I know that in the Baltics there is a certain skepticism about the French influence in the EU. I'm not on that side because I think that you have to talk to them because they are really big and they are very pro-European, even despite the fact that their conception of Europe is slightly different from what we see here from the Baltics. But nevertheless, you have to talk to them.
Yes. Thank you, Ivar, for your insights.
Thank you, Max, for inviting me.
Yes.